Okay.
Well, great. So I guess everybody can already see how amazing and wonderful Mona is. This is our warm-up conversation, but I guess we should formally introduce her and her talk today. Mona Fawaz is an old friend of mine from early urban planning conferences, I think, mainly here, who works now at the American University of Beirut, where she got her bachelor's degree before going to MIT to get her master's degree and PhD. And since then, she's been back in Beirut working in one of the most difficult planning environments around. And as if, I've always thought she's really incredible and awesome. And then I was looking at her CV to get ready for the official introduction here and realized just how much more awesome she is than I always thought. So she has so much experience and has been involved in so much in planning in these difficult circumstances that I'm sure we cannot help but learn by participating in this lecture. So check out her publications, and as I'm sure you'll be wanting to do after her presentation today. So without further ado, let me just turn you all over to Mona to help us figure out how we can all move forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kaz. Thank you for really raising the bar and now making it even harder for me to say anything, but really thank you so much for your generous introduction, for inviting me today, you and colleagues in the Graduate School of International Studies. Thank you to the students for showing up. I hope that what I'll share today will live up to half the bar that Professor Potter has set for me. So I'll start with a little warning, which is that I will talk a lot about planning. So for those of you who are not familiar with the profession, we as planners think of planning as a field of applied social sciences. So we think that in our discipline, we apply knowledge that is produced in economics, political science, sociology towards making cities more responsive to the needs of the societies that live in them. And as such, we interchangeably use planning or development planning with public policy making. When it comes to spatial planning, and I'll talk a little bit more about spatial planning today than I normally do, it is about thinking about the built environment and the natural environment, how they produce a space in which we can intervene on or design policies that make it more responsive, again, to our needs. And now, so if I use planning and you feel like it's too spatial, feel free to stop me. I don't mind being interrupted. And I do my best to sort of link both so that you see the connections. So I'm going to share my screen. I put a few pictures just so I can share with you my context. I don't want to take anything for granted. You don't necessarily know where is Lebanon. So I'll show you first that we're right here because my arrow didn't show up. And if I go to the next picture, you'll see that this is the country. It's a very small country. It's about 10,000 square kilometers. It's located in South Asia, right on the Mediterranean. So give you just a little bit of a context about what I'm talking about. And so we are very well known in the world for our very difficult history. In the 1950s, Lebanon and Beirut was known as the Switzerland of the Middle East. It was a very posh country that was visited from everywhere. But then due to numerous reasons, by 1975, we had a civil war and we became known in the world for car explosions and violence, after which we've had several wars with our southern neighbors who invaded us several times. We also have had multiple tensions, and more recently, we've joined many other countries around the world in defaulting on our foreign debts. But not only did we default, but we were the only country in the world that did not approach the IMF for a rescue package. So for the last 2 years, we've been in full meltdown. And that's where I kind of want to start. Back in April 2020, about a couple of years ago, when a colleague in our sister university sort of published a piece saying you can't imagine a more perfect storm. At the time, it was Lebanon had defaulted a year before on its external debt, and nothing had happened yet. And then the COVID crisis came. And so this overlap of health, crumbling economic, financial conditions made my colleague point to the fact that you couldn't think of a more perfect storm. Little did he know that he was just pointing to the tip of the iceberg. Of course, just to give you a little bit of an idea, what he's describing as a perfect storm, you can see here in the curves, all the curves that show the economy of the country. So by 2020, you can see that our GDP is just dipping right as it is, as is our GDP per capita. We, at the same time, and I forgot to mention this, among the things we're known for, due to the war in Syria, which is right east of us, we have the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. 1 in 4 person is a refugee. So you can imagine the situation in which people are living. And so when Basil pointed to the perfect storm, he thought that things really couldn't get worse, except that a few months later, by August 2020, we had what is estimated to be the largest non-nuclear explosion in the world. The Beirut port blast in August 2020 hit about a third of the city very severely, killed hundreds, wounded thousands, and demolished tens of thousands of homes. About a third of the city's housing stock was actually severely affected. So in 2 years after, so you can see here the impacts. This is the port explosion. It was tons of ammonium nitrate that had been abandoned in the port. No one knows whether it was a criminal act or whether it was, but in any case, an act of neglect in which a lot of ammonium nitrate had been put in the city's port, and everything in red was severely damaged, including structural problems. That's about a third of the capital city. About 2 years after the blast, more than half the city's housing stock is still unrepaired. And of course, at the national scale, the intensity of the country's meltdown continues to move at striking speed. So in less than 2 years, we have 75 to 80% of the Lebanese population estimated to live below the poverty line. 40% are estimated to be in extreme multidimensional poverty. The Lebanese currency has lost about 90% of its value. Minimum wage is today at $40 a month. 2 years ago, around this time, it was $475. Worse, the perfect storm is still unfolding with no resolution in sight. And so the question that I want to ask today is, where do we as professionals of the built environment, as planners, as public policy makers, stand from this reality? What can planners deploy from their repertoire of actions and reflection, or what can policymakers do if they want to offer more than a position of like a distraught citizen, someone who wants to take a stand, right? Someone who puts beautiful orations, takes positions, and describes big problems but has no solution. As policymakers, as planners, as designers, we are professions that pride themselves for taking knowledge into action. And I've put here the picture of one of the best known planning theorists, John Friedman, who really made it a point to say that what we distinguish ourselves as is in going beyond the social sciences, applying that knowledge to design projects that demonstrate that we are effective in responding to such devastating, intractable political, economic, financial, social crisis. And so what I want to do today in this presentation is sort of take you through what I think our role has been so far, first, very briefly in relation to the Lebanon crisis, and then propose some ways in which we can think of an alternative role and share with you some of the experiences that I have been trying to sort of open up in that direction. So the first observation I want to make is that, to be sure, if I want to assess what role we have done as public policymakers, as planners in Lebanon in the last 3 decades, I have to recognize that we have been integral to the making of the crisis. We are not just simply good doers. And I'm showing here a graph of all the building permits that were filed in municipal Beirut since the end of the Lebanese civil war. So you can see here the curve of the permits that were filed in the city. And what I've put here is the whole bundle of public policies that have been deployed to sort of incentivize investments in the built environment. And you see here the balance of payment for Lebanon. And the first thing you're going to notice is that the balance of payment is positive when the building permits are high. And it is because we have used the built environment as a lever to sort of attract foreign capital into the country. And this did not happen naturally. We have changed over the last 30 years our building laws, our urban regulations in ways that incentivize these investments. But we've also followed what is called the global financialization trend, in the sense that our central bank and our public policymakers have created all sorts of schemes that make it easier and for banks, for investment companies, but also for everyone else to invest in apartments. The outcome on our cities has also been very similar to what you see in other contexts around the world. 1 in 4 apartments today in Beirut is vacant. What I mean by vacant is that it's not occupied, no one lives inside it, and no one has even put a piece of furniture in it. So it's not expatriates, it's not a secondary home, it's a safety deposit box that is sort of left for an investor because it's a great asset. And that was so pushed in the country that the apartment became, an apartment in Beirut became in 2017 more expensive than an apartment in a secondary city in France, like Marseille or Lyon. Now, you have to keep in mind that Beirut, even at the peak of its post-war reconstruction, had never more than 8 to 10 hours of public supply of electricity, has no public schooling, no public health care. So it's a city that really doesn't have a high level of livability, and yet real estate became extremely expensive because of the policies that we as urban planners actually set in place. And of course, also other policymakers, including financial decision makers. And the tools of planning were obviously integral to this. Worse, we also worked as designers here to sort of create of Beirut the image of this posh city. And I love this picture because it shows like sort of the very nice Beirut corniche, the street lights, the here and there little house, but then it also shows all these high rises. And what you notice immediately is that there's very few floors that are lit up, because this is where financial investment is actually going. But pictures like this, projects like these designed by global architects like Zaha Hadid, Herzog de Meuron, Bernard Khoury, I mean, really big names that work otherwise in New York, London, and Paris. These images actually sort of carried the possibility that, yes, indeed, a city like Beirut that offered no livability actually had the sparks of financial success. And this became a very inspiring model. So I'm not just talking about Beirut moving in this direction. If you look into our region, the model of this development was then carried by the same actors and investors to other cities in the region. So Jordan, for example, my colleagues like Najib Khourani and Ahmed Kanna have shown how they've developed along the same way. In Morocco, Kun Bogert has shown, again, the same idea taken from Lebanon, referencing Lebanon and Beirut, and being carried again to Bohag Valley. Through all these examples, what we see is that planners in some have really contributed to the crisis. And so although, I mean, when you look at pages and pages of planning theory, we talk about like our great good faith in providing post-disaster recipes, learning from crisis. It's evident that planning is part of the problem, public policy making more general. And so that, in fact, we are in crisis just as much, and that we need to reinvent what we are doing if we want to live up to the aspirations of our profession. And here I really want to say that as much as I want to criticize planners, I also want to say that, and of course, this falls in a tradition in planning that has gained a lot of value in the last 30, 20 years. We call it, among planning theorists, the dark side of planning. So that's where we recognize that that planning can have negative side. But as much as we do that, we should also see that in the promise of planning, there was also something very special. And it's that idea that collectivities can come together and they can organize modalities of living together, that they can imagine, shape, occupy together spaces and think of how they want to share them in the future as they conduct their everyday life. This, I think, is very important for public decision and for anyone who wants to be involved in a profession that thinks about public decision making, the public in general. This is a very critical issue. And it's an aspiration that I personally am not ready to drop. In the introduction, before we started talking, Fawaz pointed to the fact that I've been in and out involved in politics in Lebanon. And that's that idea in which you kind of want to use your profession as a way of thinking about how do we, as people who share the same space, imagine and act on the spaces in a way that makes them more inclusive, more viable, more livable. And that aspiration is not limited to us. What I'm showing you here are the pictures of young people in Lebanon who immediately after the port blast went on the street as volunteers spontaneously. And for many days, they moved the rubble, they cleaned people's homes, they helped people sort of repair and fix their lives. And what was striking for me at that point is that many of them were approaching me and other colleagues and saying, so what do we do as planners? They were approaching us as professionals. How do we rebuild our cities? So just saying, yes, planning is a culprit did not feel good. You wanted to sort of think about, right? What can you do? And it's important to know that these individuals, they were very distrustful of state agencies. They were wary of the municipality. They did not think that they could go to them. And so we needed to think about ways in which we could engage planning. And in the beginning, and that became over time a larger and larger demand, because a lot of international non-governmental organizations and local NGOs got involved in repairing people's homes. And in the beginning, it was very much, the post-disaster recovery was very much about fixing people's homes. But over time, it became very clear that if you don't focus on the shared spaces, if you don't think about the collective areas that people occupy, then the neighborhoods will be abandoned, because it's not enough to fix a home. You need to help a collectivity recover. And so I think that this aspiration of making planning relevant, of intervening and using its potential is an aspiration that I share with a lot of colleagues, particularly scholars committed to what we have called in the social sciences the Southern turn in planning theory, or the Southern turn in theorization. And that turn in theorization basically asks us to think from a certain place, to recognize the importance of historic and geographic contextual factors, to account for the nature of the planning, policy systems, and the context where we work. And so for me, a turn in planning theory is one that's going to recognize first that for us to have a good practice of professional practice, we have to rethink how we know what we know and how. And here I go to Simin Davoudi, who's like a well-known planning theorist, who points out to four practices of knowing. They are basically, what do we know? How do we know it? Why do we know it? And what do we do with what we know? So if I take those four questions and I put them back into sort of a Southern turn in theorizing, then I need to first review how we know and what we know. And so the first point is we need to shift what we know, right? From this all-encompassing universal truth that we've been learned to deal with in the scientific model that we've traditionally used, to more incremental acts of learning where knowledge is a project in the making, where it's being built, where we question what counts as knowledge, what doesn't count as knowledge. We also need to put this knowledge into history and into relations. So thinking from a context is not thinking only about the context, but having the kind of conversations we're having today, to think about how ideas travel, where people learn, how they move from one place to the other. The second point that really needs to be questioned is where is the legitimacy of that knowledge coming from? And we really need here to shift our assumption from the possibility of sort of a common good that is held by a single custodian, a modern nation state, as modern public policy making thought, and to instead try to think in terms of an engagement with an ethos of care, perhaps in a feminist tradition of matters of care, where learning is relational, where the common good is built actually as we go, and where one positions themselves clearly in relation to issues. The third point I will make again about what do we know and how do we know it in the assumption of our professions has to do with who is the society with which we're working. And planning, public policy making has often assumed a model of a very harmonious society in which we can all live together happily ever after as one society, as equals. And in practice, as Vanessa Watson has argued in relation to planning, we live in societies that are deeply racialized, deeply divided, sectarian, and so recognizing a conflicting model of society is also very problematic. So we have to ask ourselves, where's the legitimacy coming from? Who's the custodian of the common good? What processes do we follow? And then what society do we hold for? And of course, these are huge questions because they make us question the very foundations of how our professions are built. But I think that they are essential if we're going to live up to the promise of what is good planning, what is planning for people, what is public policy making for people. And so to sort of offer ways of thinking otherwise, and really they're like sort of tentative approaches to that reflect on what I have with colleagues been trying to do from Beirut, I will dive into some examples of things we've done along three axes. Which I call attempts to recover planning through learning. And these are about legitimacy, process, and vision. So the first pillar of this thinking otherwise is to construct a source of legitimacy for planning. One of the big contributions of the Southern turn in planning theory has been to demonstrate that the state has biases. So if you take sort of the leading figure in the dark side of planning, what we call this dark side of planning, it's the Israeli theorist Oren Yiftachel. Oren has done a fantastic job as showing us that when public policy making in Israel thought about the common good, it actually thought about the common good of a minority of European immigrants, while the majorities were sort of considered collateral damage. So they were sent to occupy smaller towns that they had less economic prospects. And this eventually reflected on the future of the cities and more generally the country's planning in which they live. That collateral that kind of conversation is very important because it allows us to see that planning can have a dark side. That the assumption that the state is still central in who decides about the common is in and itself a very strong bias that we need to reconsider. So in cities where informality, like in Beirut, is deeply entrenched in everyday urban practices, it is reductive to limit planning practice to the compilation of a few dusty plans hidden in drawers of poorly paid municipal agents. We need to think that planning, that reflection, that act on transforming the spaces in which people live actually involves much more actors. So on the one hand, we need to recognize that simply bringing back the state in can be very difficult. And to demonstrate that, I'm showing you one of the most poignant images of the area where the port blast in Beirut occurred, where activists and government agencies keep erasing and rewriting the statement. My government did this, pointing to accountability. And so on any given day, you're going to see this wall either all white or with a new graffiti saying exactly the same message. And so there is an anger and a refusal that the state can play this role. And on the other hand, there is a tradition in Lebanon after the war with Israel in 2006. It was not the national government, for example, that rebuilt the sectors of the city. In some areas, it was simply political military parties that went and rebuilt entire neighborhoods. In other places, it was international INGOs that did it. So we cannot assume that the only actor that's going to be the custodian of the common good, that's going to give the legitimacy to planning, is going to be the state. And as such, what I've been trying to think about is how do we create some sense of legitimacy for the plans that we do. And that legitimacy then has to sort of be based on some kind of shared basis of knowledge, etc. So what we've did at the Beirut Urban Lab is we started sort of creating a shadow municipality, and then we began to sort of create relations with public agents to form an ad hoc planning unit. And so we started with something very simple, which I'm sharing with you here. We created a plan of Beirut. You're gonna maybe I'm not sure how much knowledge there is about cities in Korea, but in Beirut, we didn't even have an accurate plan of the city. So creating the map of the city in partnership with planning agencies, making it available to everyone, mapping then building developments, vacancies, access to water, access to electricity, making all of this accessible to residents, empowering a conversation about how the city is served, which neighborhoods are served on the basis of scientific knowledge, became a way in which people turn to us then to say, okay, if we know this, then what do we do? And that sort of began to accumulate around a small research center based in a university. It began to sort of create conversations around what kind of public policy making do you want? And so what I'm showing here is yet another initiative around this idea of building a planning unit, where we sought to engage public decision makers, activists, and professionals of the built environment around how do we think about land policy in Lebanon? How do we assess the land policies that were designed in Lebanon? So we designed a small group of that would meet every 3 to 4 weeks and would actually discuss and evaluate the last 30 years of land policy making and imagine where else we could go. And we invented exercises for them to do together. And of course, there are limitations to the deliberative practice because there are very strong unequal power relations, but we found out that we can begin to create at least a common vocabulary. And that's a first step. And then we started in the aftermath of the blast advocating for the making of a planning unit inside the municipality. And so these kinds of actions are not final, they are tentative, but what they have allowed us to create is a coalition of actors, public planners, professionals of the built environment, a few actors in the public sector, none of them elected, all of them sort of the director of the housing agency, engineer in the municipality, who are invested in trusting the possibility of thinking collectively the future of the city. And that becomes a partner for particularly the international community, the World Bank, etc., when they come in the aftermath of a blast and they're trying to sort of intervene in the country. So that's sort of a first effort to imagine the possibility of creating some form of legitimacy in the building around the idea of planning. Of course, this also requires a lot of sources of knowledge. So we've sort of set up this knowledge-based website that says what has been repaired and where, and creates sort of partnerships also with non-governmental organizations that are working in the neighborhood. The second thing is to recognize that whatever work we do right now has to be tactical, so planned rather than strategic. And of course, this recalls, for those of you who are trained in public policy, the very famous paper that Lindblom wrote back in 1959, this idea of modeling through, trying, learning by practice. And I want to reassure you, I'm not taking you back to a room full of white men who are thinking about limited rationality. That's not at all what I'm proposing. Instead, I'm saying that what we're trying to do is to take big ideas, but implement them through small, limited micro projects in which we stitch across bodies of knowledge and worldviews to carve possibilities, to exploit temporary openings, short-term alignments like a public space, like a pedestrianization of a street. Through these short-term interventions, we're seeking new forms of engagement through shared practice, new forms of mutual obligations that begin to be created because people have participated together. And these engagements induce, in turn, new perspectives. They generate a sense of belonging because we've done things together. And as such, the practice is more than just a particular way of doing something. It's not just a technique, it's also by working together, creating obligations for people who have already practiced things together. And here I have to say that ironically, the disaster and its recovery have offered us huge windows to do something like this, because they have affected neighborhoods and allowed for a flow of financing and experiences that were channeled towards the recovery of public spaces in ways that had never happened in Beirut, and that we as progressive planners had never imagined could happen. So recent engagements of the Beirut Urban Lab with the NGOs and private agencies, we have advocated for donors to channel aid to public space, to public spaces, and we've managed to stitch small-scale micro-interventions to actually dream for the first time of the making of a public park in Beirut. This experience is actually not unique to Beirut. I recall Alejandro Aravena in Chile describing what they did in the post-earthquake recovery and how the architect and his team recovered shared spaces in the city and built collectives and distilled tensions as they were designing the project. So the main task is not to introduce some form of deliberative planning, but to capitalize on opportunities to sort of establish new networks across disparate worldviews, make provisions and sort of that they're rife with inequalities and injustices. I don't want to give you like this idea of a la-la land, but at least they allow us to work together on temporary goals that and to create realities that then become lasting in the city. And that at the Urban Lab, we've sought to support this exercise with micro-planning by both through the platforms of knowledge and also through these deliberative workshops like the one you see that are bringing planners and designers from multiple age groups, multiple organizations to endorse together and have ownership over these projects that are being implemented. And the last thing, that's another example where the work was with the community itself in a very low-income neighborhood of the city, where my colleague sort of did deliberative planning and co-production through an approach of sort of citizen scientists that is then implemented in projects. My last and really the dearest point, and this sort of where we started before the discussion, is the idea of performance. It's that for you to be able to convince people that another alternative is possible, you have to perform. You have to create that possibility, even if it's for a limited moment. And until recently, the proposal that we could imagine ideal model cities was sort of really impossible. I mean, as a profession, we're bruised by decades of modern planning that displaced people, reproduced social inequalities in the name of science, the common good, and society. But at the same time, planners have resorted back to visioning recently, and that's been done because it allows us to facilitate debate. The fact that you can imagine otherwise really and perform it and make it possible for people to actually enact those possibilities is critical, because it allows people to not only dream or see an example, but actually practice it and play with it. In Beirut, where society is severely splintered, we've had years of civil war and social divisions along class and religious lines, sectarian lines. The belief of a common good is impossible. And so one of the campaigns, one of the exercises I did was to be engaged in a municipal electoral campaign that we put together. And over a year, we've had tens of thousands of city dwellers who suddenly projected themselves as a collective because they were able to see images of how the city can be shaped otherwise. And so the images of a coast for everyone. And it starts with plans like this that rally planners, but end with visualizations such as this one, where people see a possible alternative for a space in which they're sitting, really coalesced so many people around the possibility of a different imaginary, where it's not so much the plan that is important, but the fact that by putting out images like this, that housing can be owned in cooperatives, that the coast can be public and open to everyone and serve as an economic lever for the city that allows people to recover some kind of employment, that these then became ways in which people could project themselves. And so they started coming to public discussions like this one in the spaces where we were drawing the alternative possibilities, because they wanted to imagine that they could project themselves into that future. And that activated multiple possibilities, many of which we did not imagine. And they really culminated back in October 2019. And I don't think I put a picture of that, I'm sorry. When then spontaneously people not only occupied the historic core of the city that had been turned into sort of a high-end exclusive area, but they also began to use it the way they imagined it should be used. And so parking areas were turned into soup kitchens, they were turned into theater. The theaters that had been locked for decades were reactivated and people were performing in these places. And what this created is the possibility of actually performing an alternative society. And of course, these are moments, and those moments are fleeting and they disappear. But as they disappear, they keep that in the realm of people's possibility, the fact that an alternative reality is possible. And I'm very aware of time, so I'm going to close by saying that the implications of, so I'm going to close by saying that the overlapping crisis that contemporary society live in, and I don't think Lebanon is unique, even if it's more acute, we need to recognize that also the professions, the modern professions, are also themselves in crisis, particularly planning, public policy making, etc. So the legitimacy and practices are questioned, and they're questioned for good reasons. Yet it's possible to think of the crisis as a possible tipping point in which we can recover the aspirational side of our professions, the promise that collectivities can come together and organize modalities in which they can imagine, shape, and occupy shared spaces in the future. So maybe planning cannot alter the fundamental relations of society, and we know that, but it's still capable of holding a space for social justice, a space that we still need to actualize. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This is wonderful, engaging. I'm full of thoughts, but I would like to open up the floor for anyone else who might, excuse me, have questions to ask Professor Fawaz. I see that there are a number of urban-oriented people there, but but with that, I'll give you a second to think about these things and use my position, abuse my position to ask my own question here. So one of my questions anyways is sort of where we started at the beginning, thinking about Ukraine and this idea of people already trying to think about post-conflict planning for Ukraine. And what I have heard from other people like, Michael Hooper, if you know him at UBC, is one time he told me in dealing with Haiti in particular that he believes that it's important to try to have plans in place before disaster happens, so that in a post-conflict or post-disaster situation, there's a way to move forward. But what I'm hearing from you, part of what I think I'm hearing from you, or what I can, I'll deliberately mischaracterize it perhaps, is that it almost takes the crisis or the disaster itself to create a situation in which the kind of visioning and planning for better futures can actually begin to take place. So my kind of question here is, I mean, the story you're telling is inspirational in its own way, but how much of that can we do before disasters happen? Or is there a way to work in parallel, or what do you think?
It's a great question. I'll say a few things. In 2014, the municipality of Beirut took a $2 million loan from the World Bank to do what is called the Post-Disaster Resiliency Plan. And so that's sort of the plans that have been very common, especially post-Katrina in the US, where planners sort of design evacuation plans, etc., and then what do you do after? And the idea is that what delayed a lot the post-disaster recovery was the fact that there was no plan, and for 2-3 years in New Orleans, people fought over what is the plan, and there was no trust in the municipality, so no agreement on the orientation. So the plan actually was due to be finally delivered in September 2020, but the municipality had already a pre-approved plan. It took the municipality about a week to respond to the port blast, despite the plan. And the first response was to emulate what the activists were already doing. It bought a lot of brooms and bags and gave them to the activists to help people. I think it's incredibly important to understand that, because the plan doesn't exist without a champion, without having a legitimacy for itself. So it doesn't help to think of the plan outside of who champions the plan and who's the collective that's going to be safe, that's going to believe in the plan. And I think that's where transposing an imaginary of a functional modern nation state onto much of the world is a little bit problematic, because we know that now we're accumulating lessons. A lot of us are talking about, so what would we do? How would we do it differently if it was another time, right? But what is integral to that is who will do it, and how do they bring people together, and and who's the collective in whose name this is going to be. My fear is that such plans often end up being competition among warring actors. Now, the other point that we really need to keep in mind is that there is no just a moment of disaster. There is a continuous crisis that we're living in. And more of the world is in this situation, particularly with financialization and before it neoliberalism. And I mean, we are in moments in which people are facing on daily basis an open war on the possibility of their livelihoods. That's why I think that we need to begin today. We don't wait until after the disaster to fix. Of course, we need to think today about what brings us together as a collective and makes us imagine an alternative possibility and work towards it. But it's not just a plan that we can do or a resiliency document. It's actually a process to which our profession has to play an integral role, but it's part of bigger societal forces that it has to engage with. Makes it even harder, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I mean, so the strategy then is to I mean, people are starting to think of trying to put together sort of partial collectivities now to sort of begin the process, but presumably as the situation evolves, the collectivity itself also evolves, or?
I think we are having to deal with something which is incredibly difficult, which is we don't know what is the form of governance that we aspire to. And so we're really clinging on to the idea of a municipality, of local authorities, of representative public agencies, because we don't have anything else to cling on to. But we have sort of lost the naivete of just thinking it's about bringing the state in or it's about making a plan. We are recognizing that whatever form of shared governance we're going to adopt, it's going to be something which is constructed by people who want to carry it.
Okay. But just for one more clarification before I want to encourage other people to ask their questions as well. But I just want to confirm that this is in the context of Beirut, Lebanon, where the state itself is disintegrating and some other structure needs to take its place, right?
Yes, but also again, remember that it's not just Lebanon that's in this situation. If you look at the number of countries outside the global north that have gone through similar experiences, I mean, I gave the example of Haiti, we can talk of Somalia, we can talk of Iraq. There's a lot of countries that are undergoing similar process. And so I think, and again, it's not that the state is a bad idea, but to actually imagine and take de facto the fact that we're going to be able to rely on agencies the way we do is very problematic. It's impossible, actually. Maybe it's aspirational. Right. It's impossible.
Okay. So yeah, so I'll pause to let anyone else ask their question. I know it's been a lot to digest here, especially if you're not familiar with planning or planning theory.
All right, may I ask one question?
Yes, of course.
Before I ask, I really enjoyed your presentation with a fantastic data demonstration by using, the ArcGIS. I really enjoyed it, visualization on that. Post-war disaster, not only the economy, but also social welfare are severely damaged. Planners have to think about which part they need to work on first. But I think what do you think about which part do planners focus on between social welfare and economic development?
Thank you for the question. I think that if you see the trend that we are following now in many countries around the world that have gone through economic upheavals, financial meltdowns, etc., and more countries are experiencing this in the last 2 decades, you notice that what has become very common is to talk about social protection schemes. And what international organizations call social protection schemes are basically targeted financial packages that are given to the poorest social income groups so that they survive crisis. So that's kind of seen as social welfare. My problem, my very big problem with this is that the focus is put on the lowest social income groups, while you have entire middle classes that are usually more educated, more capable of building an economy and a longer term sustainability, that are then placed in a situation where they cannot, where they're losing almost everything. And so they either have to leave the countries, or they have to, or they become really poor. And so they're scrambling. And what that does on the longer run is it creates even more dependence on international aid. Look at the West Bank and Palestine, look at Jordan. I'm just speaking about the region, look at Iraq, but you can also look at Haiti as the poster child of this kind of crisis. That's why I think that what needs to be revised immediately is the economic model, which is being put in place so as to create a framework that allows for a longer term viability of a place. The biggest threat that faces countries like mine right now is the departure of a lot of people around us who are moving to Europe, to the Arab Gulf, anywhere they can, because they feel that this is not viable anymore. And this means that it will become 100 times harder to imagine any kind of recovery. That's why I think that that just focusing your attention on immediate crisis response social welfare is very scary. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you for your response.
Just gonna close the door, just 1 second.
Sure. So anyone else building up steam for a question? If you're uncomfortable asking it verbally, you can also, of course, type it into the chat room.
I might ask one. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. I'm currently on my way home, so I'm sorry if it's a bit noisy around me, but I was following closely at the same time trying to not run into a car because it was quite interesting. So actually, Kos and I talked over lunch about this issue of also in Seoul, we see like the housing bubble and the role of foreign investors and driving up apartment prices here. And I guess that's a global phenomenon in a way. Not really surprised to see it also in your capital, although I would not have expected it directly there to those extents. So to what extent do you think, I mean, do policies really need to adjust to restrict foreign capital to come in and to just take advantage of this building booms and speculation in the built environment? And if not, if a country decides to ban foreign capital from it, what might be the kind of penalty that it gets from it? I mean, often countries do that because they lack internal savings, right? So they try to get in foreigners to invest. But in the end, if it turns out that housing prices go up so much, and then the country ends up in a crisis because of something else, and then people can no longer afford to live there, then they move to other countries, the brain drain and all these effects, right? I mean, then nobody is helped by inviting these foreign investors, right? What do you think?
I think that what we've witnessed in the last 10 years, 20 years globally, is a trend in which land in the form of apartments and in the form of land is increasingly used as a safety deposit box, or really like an asset. And that in most countries, public policy making has failed to create a balance between that role that land has always played, but that has intensified, and on the other hand, the role of land, the social value of land as a place to work, to live, to play, to have a life. And so and that for me is more critical than whether the capital is coming from abroad or from inside the country. In my country, a lot of the money is actually produced illicitly by Lebanese people outside the country, and then it comes into the built environment as a way of sort of being stored and protected. So it's not that they are foreigners who are actually investing the capital. The problem is you end up with a city which only productivity is that it's for sale. It has land for sale. And so that means that those who can't afford to trade land in the country cannot create other forms of economies where people can live in dignity. And that is critical. We're seeing now European cities raise and sort of reject that. One of the most common responses has been the taxes on vacancy, because at least apartments that are empty. I mean, you know, you have in France, in big cities like Marseille, Rue de la République, it's like the biggest artery. It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful street. And I remember about 5-6 years ago, the entire street, the buildings are shut down. They're owned by Japanese banks. And I mean, how do you kill a city like this remotely? And so we used to think that this was a problem of rich countries. But then what we realized is what I sort of call the actually existing financialization, which is that the same way sort of Brenner spoke of an actually existing neoliberalism, that if we think of an actually existing financialization as how it actually materializes in countries where economic system, financial systems are not mature, you're going to find that the impacts are even bigger because they're uncontrolled, because they're not transparent, and because they take many different loopholes. So literally between 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 apartments in today's Beirut, in a city that has a massive housing crisis, is just held for speculation. And you look at public policy making, these apartments are untaxed because the government waives taxes if the unit is not used. So what you're doing is you're incentivizing speculation because you want to attract foreign capital to the built environment, and ultimately you've killed the local economy. So if you look now, Paris, Barcelona, Berlin recently, before them in British Columbia, all these big cities are adopting exponential vacancy taxes, resisting these kinds of strategies. And I think it's in the right direction, because otherwise we're going to end up with killing the productive role of the city. Its role as an economic engine, as a way in which the promise of the urban, that people left their rural areas for many decades to come sort of and live in. I don't know. So yeah, I think this is very critical to think about, and to think about really comparatively, because there are a few academic papers out there that say, for example, there's no financialization in Mozambique because the author looked for investment banks and banks. But actually, it's a different category of thinking that you need to find so you understand how financialization works in those other contexts. I don't know enough about Seoul to know how, but I imagine you have more advanced financial institutions. And so I would definitely look at what they own now, who owns them, what supports public policy in that direction.
Thank you.
Great. Anyone else? Oh, one of our students is asking in the chat room that she says she personally liked the performative actions like public debate during the planning process can do something good for building society in a more inclusive and cohesive way. Can you tell us more about that and share your opinion on how public policy can help this kind of activity be used for other planning projects? Well,
yeah,
big question.
It's a great question. I mean, I think that so when you perform something, you go one step beyond just looking at it. Let me just say two things. First, you know, there is this whole tradition that you have to do participation. And so if you're designing a project or a public policy for people, you need to bring them into a collective discussion. Problem is that very often those discussions end up being sort of venting sessions where people tell you all the things that don't work. And so at some point in planning, several colleagues started saying, instead of just discussing what the problem is, discuss it in relation to a solution, because that solution allows people to begin to converge towards something. And so what is that collective imagined future that you want? I mean, for me, it's the very definition of, if you want to take a step back, of politics. So you see a lot today of these oppositional politics that talk about, we don't want this, this is unjust, this doesn't work. How do you take it to the next step where then you say, this is what we want? Can you create a space where people can say, we as a collective want this? And I think public policy making, planning are very important in allowing for this to happen, because what you're trying to get is you're trying to get people to aspire to something which is the same. We want to live in a city where housing is owned as cooperatives, and so the right to housing trumps the right to own an asset in land. And so then public policy makers will design the roadmap for how we get there. And the debate will be on what kind of policy, what kind of restrictions are you willing to take if you accept that your home will be a cooperative and not, or a trust, and not an individual ownership. That's sort of how I think it can work. It's, I mean, these are visioning exercises. I didn't invent them, but when we tried them, and we tried them very skeptically, because there are a lot of inequalities in society, power differentials. And so when you try something like this, you're very aware that women will say less than men, that in a patriarchal society like Lebanon, definitely, at least, that some older people will feel more entitled than younger people. So, so that kind of, you have to try them carefully, but we also saw that it actually really brought people together, that they wanted something together, and that motivated then possible policy change. And that's where I think that it's so important to think about what is desirable, not to be afraid to throw an idea out there and get it discussed, as opposed to doing the traditional way in which we work, like, so what is the problem? We do participation, we follow scientific method, we get to a solution, which is very linear, but actually is much harder to implement. I don't know if this is answering, but that sort of is how I would think about it. A housing cooperative, a legal proposal for taxing vacancies, since we're talking about housing and financialization, a proposal for universal healthcare. And what it would take, and what are you willing to sacrifice as taxes for this to happen?
Great, yeah, that sort of reminds me of Lefebvre's transduction approach here, right?
Yes,
virtual object that becomes a guide and a measure for where we move forward. So one of my other questions, I'm going to jump in, so before somebody else gets a chance. Is sort of building on that, if this sort of construction of a sort of common collective virtual object or vision essentially my question is, how do we grow that, right? Sorry, so that let me take a step back. So I understand you to be saying that this construction of a collective vision towards which people want to move is essentially the political process. And so building this kind of common vision of the future is essential to political process. And so my question is about how you've managed, I guess, to try to keep it, concrete, how you've managed to grow these visions over time, right? Because presumably most of these common visions start with a smaller group, and then the goal is to sort of somehow incorporate or transform the vision in a way that incorporates a larger body and thus displaces the notion that the state can provide, can identify the common good, right, or the public good. Which, for those of you who are not in planning, and we don't talk about this enough, I don't think, in policy, that there's this idea that the state is able to identify the common good, the public good, in the face of all of these contradictory interests. And so kind of my question is there a way, or how have you tried, I guess is the most appropriate question, to grow these kind of common collective visions in Beirut?
Look, I mean, I don't claim success at all, no? So let's be realistic.
But we still need tactics, right?
Exactly. So the tactic has been really a lot of campaigning. Social media is amazing in inspiring people, but I think also bringing people to spaces. I think the act of performance itself, which really COVID killed us, and you could see the difference. I mean, in October 2019 in Beirut. Beirut's historic core, which had been privatized at the end of the Lebanese civil war, which was like a very high-end, posh area of malls and luxurious housing and parking areas, basically for future development, transformed in 2 weeks into squats where soup kitchens were open, public political debates were happening, theater performances were happening in the locked theaters because they didn't have any use for them. They were public buildings. And everyday protests, everyday marches, dances were happening. And it was an incredibly vibrant place of where where we could share ideas about, so things we had said about the historic core, that it should be reused as a collective space for the city, were enacted. And today we can use that memory. But that's why, I mean, I mentioned COVID, because the day it was possible for the government to say there's a lockdown, the second day they bulldozed the entire setup and they locked us down in our houses. So you can, so I don't know what would have happened if COVID didn't come, but what I can say is that when you put ideas out and they get taken up by activists, my strategy as a researcher, like if I really want to take my actual position, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, I work out of a research center in a university in Beirut. So my strategy is to always pick fights where there are activists out there who are interested in that. So my research has to echo where I already find people mobilizing and where I can put my knowledge and my visualization, the GIS that I have, everything else, at the service of people who can take it one step further than I can, actually. And that echo allows you then to make sure that through social media campaign, through protests, where people really stand together and demand something. Our biggest success so far has been on the city's coast, because although there are a lot of occupations and privatization, today no political party, no one who dreams of running for elections or playing the role of a public figure can say anything without saying the public has to recover the city's coast because it's essential for the national economy. And that's something that, I mean, we've worked on for at least 10 years. We've put proposals, we've advocated, we've protested, we've camped on the beach, but that has made a difference. And so I think it's really a combination of things. It cannot just say, but I cannot tell you how important the role of the academic is in framing the right question, in showing models where elsewhere it has happened, to make it possible for people to imagine that, and to then put the plan, actually articulate the plan almost like a professional planner, because that gives a roadmap that people can then say, yes, it's possible. You want to demonstrate the possibility. And that we learned through campaigning, because as long as we just wanted a free coast, but we didn't know the roadmap to do it, no one endorsed it. But once there was a roadmap, everyone was referring to the roadmap and they wanted it.
Right. So just a quick clarification. So I was struck by one of the early points there that it seemed important to be in the actual space that is of concern. I mean, especially since many of our people are policy people and don't necessarily think about space so much.
The space of the community, it doesn't have to be a physical space, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be the design. I mean, I work on land issues, so I work on the coast, I work on housing, so it's easier for me. But I think people mobilize together, and I think that action of committing to the fact that you go to a specific event, that you are part of something, you're not just talking about another, proved to be very important. Is that?
Yeah.
But I do see the bias of the planner more and more in what I'm saying. So.
Right. Yeah. No. And I just thought it was.
I never thought I was such a planner.
Right. But it's fascinating to me that if you're thinking about visioning a place or a space with the community or whoever, that it actually can be more effective by actually, occupying or visioning that space in the space itself. But Elisha, who is our earliest attendee here, has a question for you, I believe. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Even though I'm not from the planning background, I really enjoyed the presentation. And as somebody interested in finance and tax, we noticed that a lot of the economy, let me say, part of the economy that gets a lot of attention is the real estate side and housing sector. And also, we also find that this is the area where a lot of taxes are evaded. My question is, do you think it's a problem of planning or policy on the part of government, where you find a lot of boom in the real estate sector, very plush houses coming up in the developing economies, yet we find we get so little of tax revenue from this sector? Is it a problem of policy or planning? I want to ask.
So you have a particular case in mind or country?
Yeah, I'm actually talking from experience from my country, Ghana.
Okay.
Where we have a lot of real estate companies, and they are developing very nice apartments, yet we still have very little revenue. Property taxes are not paid. We really barely get revenue from that side.
Can I ask you a question about Ghana? Who makes the policies?
Well, it's mostly decentralized.
The people who decide on the real estate taxation, are they in government?
Yes, they are in government.
And are they also partners with real estate developers?
I can say that there is a little disconnect, because you have the real estate being wholly private enterprises.
And they're not owned by these public decision makers.
They are not owned by these public decision makers.
So you're more lucky than in Lebanon. Because for us, it's one and the same thing. My hunch, it's the problem of, my answer would be that don't separate between planning, real estate, public policy. Think about what is the value system that is guiding decision making. Why is there people who think that it is valuable to encourage this form of real estate? Who's benefiting from it? Who's not? And if you wanted to change how things are happening, who would have, I mean, suppose that, is it just, and it would seem very weird, but is it just a problem of people not knowing? So you can go visit public decision makers and say, look, there's this fantastic research center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. They can give you a package of property taxations. You introduce it, you capture value, taxation increases, and you invest them in public housing, and that will make a very equitable city. And if they don't listen to you, why is it that they don't listen to you? Where is the interest? Why are they seeing this interest in real estate that is making them encourage the real estate? In most countries that have been studied, there's a collusion of interest between the real estate machine and the public decision makers, and so real estate is undertaxed because of that. I don't know enough about Accra and Ghana, so I can't really answer. But I would assume that there is a real estate machine that is benefiting a lot from that, and that's resisting the possibility. I don't think it's incompetence only that usually does that. But you would have to study who makes the decision. And I think if you're looking for a thesis topic, it's an amazing thesis topic.
Right. So perhaps looking more to the sort of systemic business interests rather than a simple recourse to corruption as the problem, right? Or, I mean, localized low-level corruption, right? So.
Yeah, and this whole terminology of corruption that masks so many things, instead of allowing us to understand how things work. I think when you want to change things, you want to understand who's influencing who and why, not just write it off as it's all corrupt, it's all incompetent.
Great. Anyone? Oh, sorry. A Young, you have a question, please.
Yes, thank you. First, thank you for your presentation. I am not familiar with planning, but I find really interesting that you mentioned the importance of the role of other actors besides the government, like citizens or other organizations when it comes to planning. And I want to ask the role of other actors and how they can influence the planning process besides government and the people that you already mentioned, like international organizations.
Okay, so if I understand well your question, Ayam, you're asking about international organizations or you're asking about other actors?
Yeah, other actors like international organizations.
So, I mean, just to show you what is possible in Lebanon in 2011, so our northern and eastern borders are all, we're a tiny country, so we're surrounded to the north and to the east by Syria. And when the war started in Syria in 2011, in 1.5 years, we had at least 1 million refugees come in. We're a country of 3.5 million people. So you can imagine what the ability to respond in a country where anyway governance wasn't so good. So then what happened in Lebanon is you had all the international community, the United Nations, UNHCR, that takes care of the refugees, but many other international organizations, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Dutch, the Polish Refugee Council, all of them landed in Lebanon, and they all opened headquarters. And the government was saying, wait, we do not want to normalize the presence of these refugees. We already have 200,000 Palestinian refugees who have been here for a very long time. We don't want to bring in more refugees. And what they did is then they decided to work without the government. And so they set up their own headquarters. They did their own relief. They worked as if they were not in Lebanon. And the government was too weak, but also, I mean, to remember, Elisha too corrupt as well. So they were getting kickbacks, and so they were okay with it. but that created a structure of governing part of the population, which is about 1 in 4 people in the country, completely outside of the government or any public authority. And then the explosion happened in the port in 2020, and people understandably blamed the government because it was the callous attitude that of leaving so much explosives in the port for so long that actually, and the port is in the middle of the city. It's a port city. I mean, Beirut grew because the port was there and they were extracting things from Lebanon and taking them during colonial times. So basically people were very angry with the government. And so that was a great opportunity for the international community to even expand beyond. So they put themselves in charge of the post-disaster recovery, and the World Bank came and they set up a structure, an institutional structure that they call the reform structure, where they have civil society organizations and the international community working together to sort of design a recovery plan. And in the beginning, without even involving any government agencies, we got involved. And as much as I want to say that I don't think the Lebanese state is a custodian of the common good, I think the international community is even less of a custodian of the common good. So we got involved saying we're going to be part of the civil society talking to you guys to bring back public agencies. And we worked very hard to stitch back the housing agents because we also need a lever about what is right in this society. It's not an all-out land where there's and so, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is you can see scenarios in which planning state agencies are weakened and they really don't play a very strong role. But the people who are holding public agencies may not be even interested in this. They could be doing something else. So you really have to think the official institutional structures may not be involved in planning. Other very powerful actors may come and do the policy and the recovery. That weakens those who inside the state are actually trying to do some kind of the right thing. So I don't know if I've answered you, but I've tried to give you sort of a model of what can happen. And I'm sure there's nothing more, I'm confident, I'm saying this, that there's nothing more ideal than imagining actually a state institution that can be the custodian of the common good. It's an aspiration. It would be amazing to have a public representative state with elected members who have the common good of the society at their heart. But if you don't have it, it's also not ideal to have an all informal with international community, and it can be just as damaging to have that as well. So what you aspire to, that's why I answered Kaz very tentatively saying, I don't know where we're going to, and we are learning to accept the fact that we don't know what is it that institutionally we will struggle for, but we work towards values. And we try to sort of push for those values of equity, viability, etc.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Anyone else? Richard, you turned on your camera. Does that mean you have a question or no? Just wanted to be part of everything. You're on mute though.
For now, I don't have any questions to ask. Maybe at the end of the program.
Okay. Well, I think we have. I don't think we're going to have time for you. This time we can always email. So I guess we'll open one last question for Nuha here. But Richard, if you really come up with something pressing, we'll include you. Don't worry.
Okay, bro.
First, I would like to thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot thanks to you today. I was just wondering if leaving out the state from the planning processes could be having adverse consequences, as in making it less responsible for doing what it is supposed to be doing. And if so, are we supposed to, I mean, like from the standpoint of the civil society and the citizens, are they supposed to push for more action from the government or organize themselves and do what the state is not doing? Like, do you think that it's like one of these actions are encouraging the state to do less of what it is supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the question I ask in some ways, it's exactly the question we're asking ourselves every day, honestly. I mean, of course, we should not remove the pressure of public institutions or state institutions from doing the right thing. We need to constantly ask that they do the right thing. But at the same time, I don't want you to imagine that there is a state out there and it's just sort of not paying attention, so not doing the right thing, and we can just interpolate it and it will do the right thing. Because for the state to function properly, the state is part of a political system, and that political system has to have at least some minimum level of functionality. The ad hoc theory I'm working with right now is to separate between the political state, the elected state, and the administrative state, and to assume that at least with the administrative state, I can find partnerships that outlast the moment of the current moment of political upheaval. But on the long run, turning your back fully to the state, there is a tradition in planning theory, the radical planners, the insurgent planners, who have shown that for some small low-income communities, it made more sense to just enact what, I mean, I don't know, Holston called it, enact citizenship. So you can, Faranak Miraftab, if you're interested in this, writes a lot about it in South Africa. She basically celebrates communities that said, the state's never going to listen to us. So they did it themselves. They built their neighborhoods. They illegally got their electricity and their water. And that was the solution they moved with. But of course, the state has a lot of more resources as an institution. And so I wouldn't say that the ideal scenario is to turn your back, but don't imagine you can just advocate and just take that same thing and make it good. You have to, there is a work of reinvention that has to happen in many places. And again, I mean, I'm going to sound very nihilistic, but the idea of a modern nation state comes not the same way in all countries. In some countries, there was a natural convergence towards this structure of governing people. And it came in as internally, and it developed from the society. In other places, like in Lebanon, 100 years ago, there was no Lebanon. No one had heard of a Lebanon. So the whole thing is a colonial project at the origin. Is it the best thing we can aspire to today? Perhaps, I don't know. But definitely it did not develop naturally from the society. So people did not identify as Lebanese, and then they came together and built a structure. There was one small group that agreed with the French that they wanted to create a country, and then the others found themselves on the territory. So it's a project in the making. It has not happened. And I mean, we also have to recognize that states are a particular moment in history of humanity. There used to be empires, there used to be other kinds of things. So as planners, it's very hard for us to think about this, or as public policy makers, because our professions are tied to this moment. But sometimes it helps to just free yourself a little bit and imagine what else can be.
So the modern state as an aspirational project with muscle, perhaps. Well, so unless Richard has a pressing question, we've come to our official allotted time here. And Mona, as you can imagine, is surely busy and has exceeded even my aspirations for her at the beginning of our talk today. So I hope you'll join me in thanking her very much for sharing her thoughts with us today. And hopefully we'll be able to have her back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you really for your invitation and for the great questions and for your interest in my work, and look forward to more conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.